B'siyata d'shemaya, we begin once again 5 minutes of tefillah as we're going to begin today the final perek within the concluding remarks, Baruch Hashem. But before we get there, we have to add on one detail to what we spoke about last week. We concluded last week with the thought, with the insanity we should call it, how we're in the middle of talking to Hashem. We realize that tefillah is a conversation. We understand intellectually that I'm standing and talking to God, whether it's Shemoneh Esrei, whether it's Birchas Hamazon. And yet, what do? And yet, how often, in middle of benching, in middle of Shemoneh Esrei, in middle of tefillah, does our phone ring? Do we hear someone talking? Do we get distracted? We make a motion. And we spoke about the fact that it's almost crazy that we're bothered by such things. So Rosh Hashanah ends off with a bit of a encouraging line. And he says, I didn't write this just to tell you to work harder, not to be distracted. Because he says, in truth, it's difficult. And in reality, there are times where one is supposed to daven quickly, where one is allowed to daven quickly. There are times one has to get to a meeting. There are times where there's something called a tefillah ketzara in halacha. There are times, and it is at times appropriate to quicken up one's davening. But says Rosh Hashanah, you know why I wrote this? So we should teach ourselves and realize that, okay, maybe on those big things are difficult. What about on all the small, tiny, minor disturbances that we just don't disregard? What about on the fact that we're davening and we hear a conversation and we're attuned to that? Says Roshim Sheminkis, that is a level that we could all dream and try to attain. That is a level that we could realize. It's Shemoneh Esrei. It's benching. And he ends and he says, Halavai, one is able at the moment that he davens to be as if, he calls it, he died with the misa of neshika. It's as if he's blissfully out of this world as he talks to Hashem. And b'siyata d'shemaya, he concludes, we should be zeicha. And then he starts this last parak teaching us, so what's the eitzah? How do we get there? I think we're all convinced. We're sitting here at the end of the Sefer, and we're probably discussing now the most difficult aspect of the whole thing. Having kavanah, not being disturbed. So he says, what's the eitzah? He says, you know what it is? An eitzah amuka, a deep eitzah. But you realize it's a deep piece of advice. It's not going to be a simple, segula. It's something a little bit more difficult. And he says, you know what it is? It's called achana. Something we spoke about at the beginning of the Sefer, to prepare for tefillah. But he says there's one level of preparation that you make sure that you're thinking only about the tefillah. But he says there's something deeper about preparing for tefillah. And that is well in advance of one's davening to organize in his mind, in his thought, in his action, that what am I going to do? I'm going to daven. He says some have the practical minhag of saying to say l'shem yichud, which is doing what? It's calling to the forefront of our minds and saying, what am I doing now? I am talking to Hashem. But he says there are ways to prepare to build it into the schedule. And he says an incredible mashal. He says, we all know the tefillos of the Yom Narayim, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, we have better davening. And the question is why? So one might say, well, because it's Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur, there's incredible Kedusha to that day. And that's true. But he says, you know what else it is? He says the reason is because we prepare for it. Whether he says a Ben Torah, Talmid Chacham, the whole year maybe, at times dreams about the nostalgic Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur. Or maybe for the rest of us, at least the month of Elul, we know it's coming. It gets closer with Slichais. It gets closer on Erev Rosh Hashanah, to the point that we are focusing constantly on these tefillahs that we're going to say, and how special, how lofty, how incredible they are. So says Rosh Hashanah, we can do this every day. We have to find times to build into our schedules, to think, to realize I'm going to daven mincha. And even the simple reminder, okay, I'm going to daven now. Maybe on the way, realizing what am I going to do, goes a long way. And we'll conclude with a mashal. He says so beautiful. He says, imagine one is traveling and unfortunately he's Erev Rosh Hashanah and there's a delay and there's an issue and he shows up mamish minutes before. He quickly rushes, he runs into shul. Will he now say, oh, I wasn't prepared, and he just blows through davening and goes home like he would do in a random Ma'ariv? Of course not. Why not? Not just because it's Rosh Hashanah, because the whole time he was preparing. And even as he was traveling, I'm going to Eretz Yisrael for Rosh Hashanah, I'm going to the Rebbe, I'm going to Yeshiva, I'm going to daven. And as there's difficulties, he knows, I'm going to daven, it's Rosh Hashanah, it's the Yom HaKadosh. So at some level throughout our days, throughout our lives, throughout all the tefillahs, if we were to build in a little bit of a realization beforehand, I'm going to daven, it's about to be mincha, it's about to be ma'ariv, it's going to be shachris, I'm going to turn off my phone, I'm going to focus. That itself lays the framework so that when we begin davening, it will be that much easier.